My name is Lorna Whitaker. I'm 70 years old, and I used to think I'd experienced every kind of humiliation life could throw at me. That belief ended the moment I heard my daughter-in-law say, "She's not your real grandma." We were on a family vacation in the Blue Ridge Mountains, staying in a rented cabin that I'd quietly paid for without anyone's knowledge. The evening sun was casting golden light across the porch, where I sat watching my 8-year-old grandson, Logan, play with his toy trucks on the wooden steps. Then came her voice, sharp, cold, and carelessly loud. "She's not your real grandma, Logan." It sliced through the soft mountain air and lodged itself in my chest. Logan looked up, startled, his small brow furrowed. "What do you mean, Mom?" Melanie stood in the doorway, arms crossed and a half-finished glass of rose in her hand. She smirked as if she'd just told him Santa wasn't real. "She's just your dad's mom, honey. She's not really family like us. We're your family. She's just here?" Logan blinked, confused, glancing back at me with uncertainty. My heart broke for him, but not for me. Because I had been waiting for this. Not hoping, not wishing. Waiting. For 3 years, I had lived a quiet experiment. After my husband Peter passed away, I allowed everyone to assume I was financially struggling, barely getting by on a small pension. I let Melanie treat me like a burden. I let Brandon, my son, pretend not to notice. But this moment, this exact phrase was the last piece of evidence I needed. The final data point. The proof. Instead of crying, I smiled. Not the polite, awkward smile you learn to wear at awkward dinners or condescending holidays. No, this one came from somewhere deep inside me. From the part of myself I had been forced to lock away over the past 3 years. The performance was almost over. Brandon stepped outside behind her, saw my expression, and frowned. "Mom, why are you smiling like that?" I met his eyes and replied calmly, "I'm just glad we're all here together." Because tomorrow they would finally understand who I really was, and who they had chosen to become. And nothing after that would ever be the same. 3 years ago, when Peter died, everyone assumed he'd left me with almost nothing. That was partially true on paper. What they didn't know, and what I chose not to reveal, was that I had quietly built an independent fortune during our 50-year marriage. Peter worked at a small auto parts factory for most of his life. He was a kind man, humble and hardworking, but never interested in money beyond providing for our son. While he focused on the present, I focused on the future. Over decades, I learned to invest. Slowly, carefully, quietly. It started with a modest inheritance from my aunt. I never told anyone about it. I purchased undervalued real estate, invested in emerging technologies, and funded a few small businesses in our community. I read financial journals while others watched TV, and I made sure that every dollar I spent looked average. By the time Peter passed, our net worth had grown to just over $50 million. But I didn't tell Brandon. I didn't tell anyone. Because I needed to know what kind of people were they when they thought I had nothing left. I sold the house Brandon had grown up in, just as he'd suggested at the funeral, politely. Of course, with phrases like downsizing and practicality. I moved into a small apartment complex downtown. The building? Mine. But I let them believe I was just another retired widow struggling to make rent.
Brandon's calls became less frequent. Melanie stopped inviting me to family holidays. When I was included, there were always whispers about how I shouldn't bring gifts or food because you've already done so much, Lorna. They never asked how I was doing. They never asked what I needed. Instead, they offered suggestions that were more like dismissals. "You should consider moving into a senior community," Melanie once said over dinner. "It's affordable, safe, and you'll meet people your age." What she meant was, "We don't want you around." They believed the illusion I had created. I drove an old car, wore the same few cardigans, clipped coupons when we went grocery shopping together. And every time Melanie made a patronizing comment about living within your means, I smiled and nodded. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was gathering information. Watching. Listening. Measuring their behavior not just as a mother or a mother-in-law, but as a woman who had the power to change everything. And slowly, painfully, I began to understand the truth. It wasn't just neglect. It wasn't just inconvenience. They were recalibrating the family tree and I was no longer on it. But I wasn't ready to speak. Not until I was certain. So I waited. 3 long years. Until the moment Melanie told Logan I wasn't his real grandmother. And in that moment, I knew the test was complete. That night, after Melanie's cruel words echoed through the cabin, I stayed on the porch long after everyone had gone inside. Logan had hugged me before leaving, his small arms wrapped around my neck with the pure affection only children can give. "You're my real grandma, Nana. I don't care what mom says," he whispered. I nearly broke right then, but I didn't, because I knew what I had to do. I listened as Melanie complained loudly through the thin cabin walls about cooking, about how tired she was, about how hard it was to host me, as if my presence was a chore she had reluctantly agreed to. Brandon, as always, said nothing. He played the role of neutral peacemaker, choosing silence over confrontation. It reminded me too much of Peter, who had also avoided conflict to keep the peace often at my expense. I checked my phone. A message from my attorney, Richard Morrison, lit up the screen. "Everything is in place. Are you ready for tomorrow?" I typed back one word. Yes. This trip had been the final stage of my plan. I had suggested the vacation, paid for the cabin, even booked the rental car in Brandon's name. They believed it was his gesture of kindness, one more illusion I let stand. The pull-out couch I slept on creaked beneath me that night, the lumpy mattress pressing into my back. But I didn't mind. It was temporary. I thought about all the ways I'd been minimized these past 3 years, not invited to school plays because they claimed I couldn't afford the gas, given paper plates while the rest of the family ate on china, left out of family photos, gifts, decisions, and memories. The worst part wasn't what they did. It was how natural it had become for them, how easily they accepted a version of me that was small, tired, and no longer central. What Melanie didn't know, and what Brandon had clearly forgotten, was that I had been quietly building a future not just for myself, but for Logan. I was no longer interested in being tolerated. I was no longer willing to be treated as optional. The next evening, everything would come to light. They would learn that beneath the cardigans, beneath the coupons, beneath the carefully crafted image of helplessness was a woman who had been paying close attention. And now it was time to act. But first, I had to endure one final morning of being treated like a burden, because before the truth could be revealed, the illusion had to be complete. The next morning, I rose early. The cabin was still quiet, the kind of silence that only exists in remote places before the day begins. I brewed my coffee in silence, watching the steam rise and thinking about the moment that was finally approaching. Melanie emerged from the bedroom around 9, her hair done, her tone sharp. "You're up early." I slept surprisingly well, I said, which was true. The weight I'd carried for 3 years had lifted. The lumpy mattress felt like clouds compared to the burden of silence I was about to shed. We spent the morning hiking to a nearby lake. I kept pace easily, surprising even Logan, who asked, "Nana, how come you're walking so fast today?" "I feel good today," I told him, squeezing his hand gently. "Sometimes you surprise yourself." Brandon looked at me with a puzzled expression, as if he was seeing someone unfamiliar. He was right. That afternoon, I excused myself and drove into town while they napped. I went to a small gourmet market and purchased everything I needed: ribeye steaks, fresh herbs, handmade chocolate truffles, and a bottle of peanut nour that cost more than Melanie's entire week of groceries. Back at the cabin, I began preparing dinner with care. Every movement was deliberate: seasoning, roasting, plating. I hadn't cooked like this in years, not because I couldn't, but because I wasn't appreciated when I did. By the time I called them to the table, the air smelled of rosemary, butter, and something else: anticipation. Brandon entered first. "Ho, this smells incredible." "It does," Melanie said slowly, her eyes scanning the table. "Where did all this come from?" "Oh, I went into town," I replied lightly. "Found some things on sale." "On sale," she repeated, her voice flat. Logan bounced into the room and clapped. "Best dinner ever." We sat down. The steaks were cooked perfectly. The vegetables were roasted with garlic and thyme. Melanie chewed slowly, watching me with growing suspicion. "This is amazing, Mom," Brandon said between bites. "Where'd you learn to cook like this?" "I've always cooked like this. You just haven't noticed." She narrowed her eyes. "And the wine? That's not exactly budget friendly." I poured myself a glass, savoring the rich aroma. "Sometimes you get lucky." Melanie didn't respond. She just stared at me, waiting for whatever was coming next. I set my fork down and reached for my tablet, which I had placed nearby. The room quieted. "There's something I need to share with all of you," I said calmly. Brandon froze. Melanie gripped her wine glass. Even Logan looked up, sensing a shift. I turned the tablet around so they could see the screen. "This," I said, "is the portfolio summary of my investments." Brandon leaned forward, his eyes widened. Melanie stopped chewing. $52 million, displayed in black and white. The room went still. I looked each of them in the eye. I'm not who you think I am, and this dinner, it's not just a meal. It's the end of an act. They didn't know it yet, but their lives had just changed forever. Silence followed. Brandon blinked at the screen like it was a hallucination. Melanie leaned in, her face paling with every passing second. "This is real," she asked, her voice barely audible. "It's very real," I replied. "These are the accounts your father and I built. Quietly. Intentionally. Over 5 decades." Brandon finally spoke. "But the apartment, the bills, we thought." "You thought I had nothing," I finished. "And you behaved accordingly." Melanie stood suddenly, knocking over her chair. "You've been lying to us." "I've been observing you," I corrected, "watching how you treat someone when you think they have nothing to offer." She stared at me, trembling. "We included you in everything." "No," I said calmly. "You managed me like a chore, like an obligation to be tolerated." Logan's voice broke the tension. "Nana, why is Mom upset?" I reached across the table and took his hand gently, because sometimes, sweetheart, grown-ups realize they've made mistakes. I let the silence settle again before pulling out a manila envelope from my bag and laying it on the table. Brandon looked at it warily. "What is that?" "My revised will." My attorney drew it up. "Everything has been decided." Melanie looked as if she might faint again. "I've placed my estate in a trust," I said. "Logan will inherit it when he turns 25. Brandon's eyes flicked to his son. "Wait, Logan." "Yes, but the trust has conditions." Melanie found her voice. "What conditions?" I folded my hands on the table. "Logan's access to the trust depends on one thing, that he maintains a relationship with me. One that is not filtered, managed, or obstructed by either of you." Brandon looked stunned. Melanie's mouth opened, then closed. "If I find that either of you is poisoning him against me, limiting our time together, or making me feel like an outsider in his life again, the money goes to charity. All of it." They sat in silence. "There's more," I added. "I've established a separate fund to cover Logan's education, healthcare, and general well-being, administered independently. You won't be financially responsible for those expenses, but you also won't control the money." Melanie let out a slow exhale. "You're blackmailing us." "I'm setting boundaries," I corrected. "After 3 years of being treated like I was disposable, I've decided to act accordingly." Brandon looked shattered. "You planned all this." "I prepared for this," I said, "because I knew the moment would come when you'd finally show me who you really were." I stood slowly. "And now you have a decision to make." Melanie glared at me. "What if we don't agree?" I met her gaze without blinking. "Then you'll spend the next 17 years watching your son grow up, knowing your cruelty cost him $52 million. The room was dead silent. And for the first time in years, I felt absolutely at peace. The next morning, the air was crisp with the quiet stillness that follows a storm, emotional, not weather-related. I woke up on the pull-out couch for the last time, my back aching, but my mind settled. Logan was already awake, swinging his legs at the kitchen table, a bowl of cereal in front of him. He looked up and smiled. "Morning, Nana. Are we going home today?" I kissed his forehead gently. "Yes, sweetheart, we're heading home." Brandon appeared in the doorway not long after, his face drawn and tired like he hadn't slept. He gestured toward the porch. "Can we talk?" Outside, we sat side by side on the wooden steps, the lake shimmering in front of us like nothing had changed, though everything had. He took a deep breath. "We want to accept your terms, all of them." I didn't respond right away. I studied his face, searching for sincerity instead of strategy. "Liar is not happy," he continued. "But she knows we don't have a choice." I turned to him slowly. "That's the thing, Brandon. You do have a choice. But if you're only agreeing because you feel cornered, then this won't work." He looked out over the lake for a long moment, then said quietly, "I failed you, not just as a son, but as a man." I swallowed hard. I had waited 3 years to hear him say that. But now there was no satisfaction, only sadness. "You failed yourself," I said softly. "You let your wife dictate the value of your own mother. You allowed her to treat me like I was nothing. And you said nothing." He wiped a tear from his cheek. "I didn't realize how far things had gone until last night." "You didn't want to realize it," I corrected, "because realizing it would have meant doing something." He nodded, ashamed. "Can you forgive me?" he asked. I took a moment. I can learn to forgive you, but forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. The past 3 years happened, Brandon. They left marks. He looked down at his hands. What do I do now? You start showing up differently, not with grand gestures, but with consistency. You stop treating me like I'm lucky to be included and start acting like family means something. I looked back through the cabin screen door. Lyra was at the table, eyes swollen from crying, fingers clinging to a mug like a lifeline. She'll have to decide who she wants to be too, I said. Because this isn't just about me. It's about what Logan is learning from all of us. Brandon nodded. He deserves better. I gave a slow smile. So do I. The old porch creaked as we sat in silence, the lake sparkling before us. For the first time in a long while, we were finally having an honest conversation. 6 months later, I was sitting in the sunroom of my new home, my real home, 2 hours away from the city. Logan knelt beside me, helping replant basil in our small herb garden. His face was smudged with soil, his smile effortless. The distance had proven to be just right. Far enough to create boundaries, close enough to keep what mattered. Brandon visited every other weekend, sometimes with Lyra, sometimes alone. I could tell those solo trips were his way of reconnecting without her shadow lingering over us. I respected the effort. As for Lyra, she had gone through stages: denial, resentment, forced cheerfulness. Eventually, she settled into a strained politeness that, while not warm, was sustainable. I didn't need her love, just her respect, and for now, that was enough. Logan, though, was the real victory. Free from the quiet poisoning of my image, he was open-hearted again, curious, present. Ours was a bond built not on gifts or guilt, but on moments. Pancakes on Saturday mornings, rock castles, stories about his grandfather that no one else had bothered to tell him. One afternoon, as we watered thyme and oregano, he looked up and asked, "Nana, is it true you're really rich?" I chuckled. "Yes, sweetheart, it's true." "Does that change anything?" "No," I said gently. "Does it change how you feel about me?" He shook his head. "You're still the same Nana who makes the best pancakes and finds the coolest rocks." I smiled, heartful. Exactly. Money doesn't change who we are, but it can show us who that is. Later that evening, after Brandon picked him up, I got a text. "Thank you for today. Logan won't stop talking about the garden. Same time in 2 weeks?" I replied, "Of course. Drive safe, Dot." The relationship we had now wasn't perfect, but it was honest, earned, built not on performance, but on truth. For 3 years, they believed they were slowly pushing me out, but I had simply been walking away on my own terms. And finally, I was home.